Now we're on. All right. So I had the absolute joy of being able to officiate at a very small wedding ceremony yesterday, and it is a beautiful reminder from the opening blessing that we do when we are drinking from the first cup of wine at a wedding ceremony, of thanking God for sanctifying our most intimate of moments, for creating out of the intimacy of a couple this blessed holiness that comes into it through marriage and through the blessings that we receive. Keep that in mind as we study today's topic, because we're going to be looking at some intimate things. The Torah doesn't blush. The Torah doesn't shy away. The Torah is not a prude. The Torah doesn't avoid talking about sensitive topics, because this too is part of our life, and this too is part of what God has created for us. And as we talk about this section today, just keep that in mind. All right, so we have been going through the section of Vayikra that makes everybody so happy, where we are talking about tum'ah, where we are talking about ritual impurity. And so far we've talked about a number of different skin manifestations that can create ritual impurity in somebody. And now we're going to look at what is usually euphemistically called in English discharges. Okay, now most people are familiar with the female forms of discharges. The most common, that is to say monthly, is called nida. And that is the monthly cycle that requires the mikveh afterwards, and during which there is a suspension of intimacy. And then there is another form of female discharge known as a zava, where a woman has had something come out that wasn't at the normal time things come out. That is to say, it is an abnormal discharge. And abnormal, again, as we've hopefully been made really clear over the many times we've talked about these sorts of topics, doesn't mean bad, evil. Just as being ritually impure doesn't mean bad or evil. And the abnormal discharge is something that happens when it doesn't normally happen. Make sense? Good. How much have you heard about the male versions? Did you know there were male versions for all of this? Maybe a little? Okay. Well, there are. And the Torah talks about them. And we're going to talk about them today. So welcome to Egalitarianism 101, where we talk about men just as much as we talk about women. Because sometimes men just don't get enough coverage.
Sometimes they get too much.
Well, yeah, but if we're going to be egalitarian, we have to take care of both sides of that problem.
That's another class, right?
Exactly right. All right. So we are on page, oh, look at that, 666. Well done. Chapter 15. A number which holds no significance in Judaism. But it looks cool on the page. What was the old joke? It's like, does he have 666 on his head? No, it's just 3 9s. If you look at it from upside.
Right.
All right, so I need a reader. And someone who can read without blushing or cringing. Am I going to have to read this, or is everyone married? You're brave.
I will be doing it.
You're a modern woman.
I hope so. My grandson says I'm cool.
Oh, you don't get higher praise. A grandson who thinks you're cool.
Absolutely.
That should be on the plaque on the wall.
The Lord, we're starting with 15.
Yeah, right at the beginning of 15.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any man has a discharge issuing from his member, he is impure."
All right, so the word member isn't actually here. The word member the word that's used is actually his flesh, and it's through rabbinic analysis that we understand this doesn't just mean things discharging from random parts of the body, but a specific part of the body.
The impurity from his discharge shall mean the following: whether his member runs with the discharge or is stopped up so that there is no discharge. His impurity means this: any bedding on which the one with the discharge lies shall be impure. and every object on which he sits shall be impure. Anyone who touches his bedding shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. Whoever sits on an object on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure till evening. Whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure till evening.
All right, so we're going to pause there. So we're noticing a pattern here, right? So this is, in fact, the same pattern that happens when there is a discharge among women, although, like I said, those laws are much better known by a wider population. And the basic idea is that if you have become ritually impure from this type of impurity, that you do transfer that to others. You can transfer it by touching, you can transfer it by them sitting where you were sitting, them sleeping where you were sleeping. Remember, by the way, ancient world sleeping, you didn't have pajamas. That you didn't have extra sets of clothes that you only wore at night. That's just kind of crazy talk. So the transferal was a concern, and the impurity lasts after the washing until evening, and then once evening falls, you are now ritually pure from that point on. Make sense? Makes sense. Onward.
If one with the discharge spits on one who is pure,
the idea would not be that this was intentional, I hope.
the latter shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure till evening. Any means for riding that one with the discharge is mounted shall be impure. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be impure until evening, and whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain impure until evening. If one with a discharge, without having rinsed his hands in water, touches another person, that person shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain pure until evening. An earthen vessel that one with a discharge touches shall be broken, and any wooden implement shall be rinsed with water.
All right, so
Can I ask a question? Why until evening?
it was a delayed purification in the sense that once you were out of the mikveh, there was still a lingering issue, so to speak, of possible impurity. Until evening came, then enough time had elapsed that we were no longer concerned. So it was a forced period of precaution. It's sort of like when your doctor tells you to take the antibiotics all the way up through the last pill, even though you stop feeling sick 2 days before you get to the end of the course of antibiotics. It's just enough extra bonus time to make sure. So, I mean, again, it doesn't have to make perfect sense to us. The rituals for purity were not always revolving around things that made empirical sense. That is to say, that could be measured in microscopic or physical ways. They were rituals to help us feel that we had returned to a state of ritual purity, to make sure that we felt that we were back in balance with what the Torah wanted us to be in. It wasn't necessarily that somebody had measured that until evening was good enough. That was what God told us was good enough, and therefore we should feel it had been good enough. And one thing I want to remind us of, we've talked about this before, but it really always bears repeating, is we often feel that the opposite of these mitzvot is to do nothing. That is to say that the opposite of wait until evening would be don't wait at all. The opposite of he's ritually impure is we don't care about this at all. But for much of human history and many human cultures around the world, the opposite of this was to be much more extreme. The opposite of coming into contact with someone who was ritually impure was you became ritually impure. That somebody might have ritual impurity that was considered permanent, such as the untouchables as a caste within the world of India, or that the rituals of the rite of repurification could be much more extreme than this. And that was something that the Torah was deliberately working against. There is a innate sense of purity and impurity that most humans have. And sometimes, oftentimes, we will become more and more excessive in how we treat our feelings of impurity and how we try to restore balance. The Torah tries to take it out of our hands and our own obsessions and say, this is what you need to do. And once you have done this, you have done what is necessary, and you don't need to go nuts. So it's always important to bear that in mind, that the Torah is not the extreme version. The Torah is the balanced version. There's zero, and then there's lunacy. And the Torah tries to keep us a long way from that lunacy. It's not requiring, it is also limiting how far we have to go. Make sense? Okay.
When one with a discharge becomes purified of his discharge, he shall count off 7 days for his purification.
That is to say, when it stops, right? So this is the original guy again, that no longer is having the discharge, and once the discharge has stopped, he starts counting. And he says, 1 day, no more discharge. 2 days, and gets up to 7.
He shall count off 7 days for his purification, wash his clothes, bathe his body in fresh water, then he shall be pure. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and come before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. He shall offer them, the one as a purification offering, and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the priest shall make expiation on his behalf for his discharge before the Lord.
All right, so this is the abnormal discharge for a man. Right? This is not what's supposed to be happening with his body. This doesn't happen in any normal or predictable way. And while it's happening, he is considered ritually impure. Once it stops, he counts 7 days of no more discharging, and then he would bring a sacrifice to the tent, and then later Jerusalem, and then he would be okay with the washing and the Mayim Chaim, the what do they call it? The pure waters at some point, the living waters, literally, which is what we call the mikveh in the modern world. Got the parameters? All right, so if that is the abnormal version for a man, what is the normal version? Next paragraph.
When a man has an emission of semen, he shall bathe his whole body in water and remain impure until evening.
All right, and that is just as it is. This is not abnormal. This is in the normal interaction. This could come up fairly regularly. This is not something that would be like, oh my God, what's happening to me? It would be, this is what happens.
All cloth or leather on which semen falls shall be washed in water and remain impure until evening. And if a man has carnal relations with a woman, they shall bathe in water and remain impure until evening.
All right, and that's it for guys. So what does that mean then about the state of ritual purity for most men or most married women? They are constantly engaging in an activity. Well, maybe not constantly. They are often engaging in an activity that will render both of them ritually impure until evening. That would be, of course, until once they had bathed, and then till the next evening. And are we supposed to be engaging in those relations with our spouses?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So once more, again, emphasizing being ritually impure doesn't mean necessarily you've done something wrong. It just means you're ritually impure and cannot go to the temple, cannot partake of the holy sacrifices and those particular limits. But in this particular case, it's rather clear. You become ritually impure while performing a mitzvah. Quite similar to the fact that when the waters are being prepared from the red heifer, the para aduma, the person who prepares the ashes of the heifer, even though those waters are going to be used to purify everyone else, the guy who does the work becomes ritually impure while fulfilling that commandment. So it's not about bad and good or evil and right. It's simply about impure and pure, and this is the balance and the instructions that are being laid out.
Okay, so we've got 1 million people around here, right?
Right.
And once in a while, they're going to have carnal knowledge.
It happens from time to time. Yes. So
where-
the species
Where are
goes.
they all going to be? You're required, it's a mikvah that's required.
Well, it's a
It's a desert now.
you're talking about in the days of Torah itself,
Yeah.
right? But the desert is not the Sahara, right? The Sinai doesn't have huge flowing water
There are
everywhere,
oases, and I'm sure they can't hear them.
and there were wells of water as well, and other forms of water that were available, natural bodies.
I'm just picturing these long lines of people.
Take a number.
Yeah, exactly. Your turn to make will be in 259 days.
Right, we'll call you when it's time.
We do know, however, that mikvaot, these places to bathe that meet the criteria of Jewish law, are quite common in the archaeology of ancient Israel.
They find them all up.
They find like you can't dig anywhere without hitting a mikvah. Partly that is right. Partly that's because of the oddities of archaeology, which is if you want something to last 1,000 years, don't build it up, dig it in, right? Because when you build it up, someone might come along later and take those stones away and use them for something else. But if you dig it in, they're just going to fill it over with dirt and build on top. So mikvahs, by their very nature, are more durable as archaeological evidence. Trust me, they had many more houses than they actually had mikvahs, but the houses have all been over the centuries. All right. Let's go ahead and see how we understand, how we take apart this collection of commandments that we've just seen regarding men. By the way, can you see why this is perhaps not the most popular section of Torah to be read out loud?
Well,
It's not the part that makes the movies when they're doing the biblical adaptations of the Bible. But again, Torah has no problem of seeing every part of human life as being connected in some way, shape, or form to the balance of holiness.
It's also important to keep control of disease. And the Jewish people were much better at that than most of the other tribes.
All right, so one very practical thing.
Don't we bend over backwards to say that this is not about disease, although it is?
Right, so
Say that it's a mitzvah, and
so we certainly believe that this is a mitzvah in and of itself. However, unlike the conversations that we had about Sarat, about the skin eruption that was described in earlier chapters, this, for example, the emission of semen, we do not ascribe to supernatural means. That is to say, the seed does not come out because God made it come out. Unlike the skin eruptions, which is a spiritual, supernatural is just such a funky word. It is something that is not a straight physical medical condition. These are more likely connected to medical conditions. They are both within the normal cycle, both for men and women, and they're also within the abnormal cycle of men and women. And to your point, Malka, if a man's member, to use the wonderful JPS translation, is discharging liquids at a time when it shouldn't be discharging liquids and of a type that should not be coming out, keeping him away from other people, and especially keeping him away from intimacy, is probably a really, really good idea. And waiting till it stops and waiting a little more is also probably not a bad idea. This is long before penicillin was around. So the fact that our path to spiritual balance might also have secondary benefits towards the health of the community and health of any partners shouldn't be surprising. It's similar to the fact that when we keep kosher, we're not keeping kosher because pork was dangerous to eat.
It was.
But it was. So we shouldn't be surprised that keeping a kosher diet does help us avoid some of the potential pitfalls of foodborne illness. That doesn't mean we keep kosher because of foodborne illness, but it does bring in its wake this additional health benefit. And so this, we shouldn't be surprised that it brings with it a health benefit in its wake. Okay, But look, what other things are going on here? So Sefer HaChinuch, in its usual style, gives us a wonderful summary of some of the main points.
The explanation of Leviticus was given.
That's the discharge, the abnormal discharge, the zav.
Just as in the case of a woman, from the place whereby she incurs a slight impurity, by the menses she incurs a major impurity, by the irregular discharge.
All right, so I really punctuated that sentence terribly. All right, so let me put that into English.
Okay.
English, which sometimes you can only do it verbally. I don't know what the proper punctuation would have been. Just as for a woman, there are some times where she has a light impurity, that is to say, an impurity that is easily rectified, and that's what we call the menstrual cycle. And then there are other impurities which are harder to rectify, and that's what we call the zava. So too with men. We have things which are a light impurity, the seminal emission that we read about in verse 16, and then things which are major impurities, which are the irregular discharge that we read at the beginning of chapter 15. Does that work better than my punctuation?
Yes.
Exactly. So what he's trying to say is that men and women have equal roots to ritual impurity, and they both have a minor version and a major version. Good, onward.
In substance, this discharge is something that issues from a man as a kind of liquid, and at the emission he feels neither lust nor pleasure.
All right, so they're trying to rule out that this is not happening because you're worked up. So you don't need to worry about those discharges. Those discharges are a different category.
Our sages of blessed memory thought that it resembles the liquid of dough from barley flour, and it likewise resembles the white of a rotten, unfertilized egg.
It's so poetic.
Seed,
It's lovely.
however, is not so, being like the white of a sound fertilized egg.
All right, I guess if you're a farmer, you know what a rotten, unfertilized egg looks like. Or if you work with barley, you know what that looks like. But what they're saying is that this is an off color, and this is something that is easily distinguishable from the normal discharges that a man has in the regular course of life. So this is definitely what we would call abnormal.
At the root of the precept lies the reason that the eternal Lord, blessed is he, removed us from excesses and commanded us to be holy and decent in regard to food and drink and in all other human activities.
And now you're scratching your head going, what? Keep reading.
There can be no doubt that this matter of discharge will happen to a person when he persistently leaves the straight and decent path in his eating and drinking, amassing in his body, as a result, that putrid, abhorrent, unclean excess.
All right, so Sefer HaChinuch is saying the reason why you're leaking like this is because you have stuffed yourself with nastiness. And it's got to go somewhere, right? You've turned your body into a waste pit for horrible, horrible things. Waste pits ooze. I mean, anyone who's ever, I don't know if anyone here has ever had the joy of working around dumpsters, will know that garbage seems to have this way of creating a fetid fluid out of nothing. You can throw in dry garbage and you come back a week later and there's going to be an ick at the bottom of that dumpster that seemed to come out of nothing. And that's what he's saying, is that if you live an icky life, you shouldn't be surprised when ickiness flows forth out of you. And that flowing should be a wake-up call that you are living wrong. Much like many of the symptoms in the modern world that we know come along with venereal diseases that are often contracted through risky sexual behavior, should be a wake-up call. If you have the difficulties that can come with gonorrhea, for example, which in some ways has there's a strong resemblance to this, that should probably be a reminder that A, you should be careful with not infecting other partners, and B, you might want to rethink how you've been selecting your partners recently, that perhaps you have been a little more cavalier than you should. Right? So he's saying it's the excesses that you're stuffing in you coming out in this putrid form.
As the sages of blessed memory said, It is the way of excessive food to lead to a discharge. So the Torah informed us that a man who has this condition is called unclean. Uncleanness being a term that covers everything repulsive and corrupt. By keeping ourselves distant from this, we will acquire in our spirit the quality of straightness, decency, and balance in all our thought and all our strength.
Right? So by looking upon this and saying, this comes because of these reasons, we will then keep ourselves from those things. Right? This becomes an instructional moment. That's what they call a learning moment, where you go, you know what? I see what's happening to him, or I see what's happening to me, and I am attributing it to a fault in how I'm living, in addition to all the other steps that are taken for the ritual purification and cleaning and treatment of this. I'm also going to examine the morality or the ethics of how I've been guiding myself in life. Yes? No? Maybe? Reactions?
Yeah.
Hurled fruit? Okay. You know, I'll keep the options open.
From this concept, it follows that a person who is not unclean,
A person is not unclean.
that a person is not unclean.
Right.
On seeing one discharge,
That is to say, by seeing just one discharge.
since that liquid has not become so strongly contained in his body.
Right. The rabbis say if it happens once, it's okay. You don't worry about it.
The small amount is not an indication that he is very accustomed to go off the straight and decent path. And in that case, it is not right to declare him unclean for that small quantity. For a man is so constituted that it is impossible for him in any way to be saved from going out of the straight and proper line at all.
A very important sentence there. All right, what's he saying?
You're allowed a little bit of the wrong thing.
Maybe allowed is not the right word, but we know what's going to happen. All right, we know that everyone goes from the straight and good path from time to time. That's called being human. That's a big part of what the Torah was designed around telling us what the straight path was, and also about helping us to correct so that we return to the straight path, because it never imagined that we would always walk the path perfectly. So the fact that this happens once, you know, you're human. Fine, we're not going to call you unclean just because it happened once. Onward.
But when he goes far out, he is then called guilty, and he deserves to be ritually unclean. Although our sages of blessed memory said, in 7 ways is a man with a discharge examined by food, drink, jumping, a burden, illness, or a sight, or improper fantasy. That is, if he suffered it on account of this, he is not defiled.
All right, let's make sure we understand that. The guy comes to the sages and says, I had a discharge. And they will ask him, well, were you eating something weird when that happened? Were you drinking something unusual? Were you jumping and there was a jarring motion that maybe has dislodged whatever has happened? Were you carrying something heavy? Think hernia style problem here. Were you particularly sick? Was there something that you were looking at that was getting the blood moving, meaning your passions? Or were you actively engaged in a particular fanciful construction? If it was any one of those things happening, well, that's normal. It's not good, but it's normal. And so therefore you do not get categorized as ritually unclean. Clear?
Yes.
Clear.
Our argument is not refuted by this, for the meaning is that it is for us to investigate if the discharge happened to him as an event of a single time, and he is then not to be declared defiled by it, or if this became entrenched in his body by force of a bad habit to which he became accustomed by many repetition, and it is proper to declare him unclean.
Right? So he's saying the fact that the discharge can be ruled out as not being problematic for any of these 7 things doesn't mean that what I said about this coming because of improper living should be ignored. because it might happen from one of these 7 things once, no problem. But if it's happening often, that means there's something that has become entrenched in your life that's causing this to happen repeatedly. And that is the problem that he's talking about. All right, I want to make sure we understand the path that's happening here. So don't worry, I'm not doing illustrations. Apparently, I'm really not doing illustrations. That pen has discharged its last.
It's time for another new set.
Okay, that's right. You got the last set, didn't you? Yeah.
Next time I go.
It was 5 years ago, so I guess these do wear out eventually. We've written a lot of Torah on this board. All right, so you got a guy, and the guy has a problem. So what happens? He has to go down to the sage, right? We're going to call him the sage / priest. They were synonymous in that day, on the days of the Torah. And the sage is going to examine. And from the examination, it's either going to be normal or abnormal. If it's normal, then we already have the ritual to take care of it that we talked about. Wash till evening, you're fine. If it's abnormal, then we have to wait from the stop for 7 days and then bring a sacrifice. Is that clear?
But in
Yeah.
the abnormal case, you're not bathing or washing your clothes
No.
until after the 7 days.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right. You wait until the 7 days, and then you do the wash, and then you do the sacrifice. But there's something really, really interesting about all of this. And let's see if this one works for the drama of a different color. It's this line right here. What happens right there?
He goes for help.
He goes for help. Do you think anyone else in the entire community knows that a discharge is happening? No, no one else knows. I mean, this is not like the lesions that can go on the body of Tzara'at, where everyone can go, whoa, Bob, you got to go get that checked out. This is something between him and his trousers that no one else is witness to. And there's no way anyone else would witness it.
Except the spouse.
Possibly a spouse. Possibly even there. I mean, from the sound of it, this is not something that is happening during the normal course of intimacy, which means that he probably would not be in a position to discharge where a spouse even could see. But he chooses to go, to have the analysis done, to have the examination, and then the rendering of what this counts as. Is this a normal discharge? Is this abnormal? And then what the remedy would be. But it's that decision to go that starts all of this. The Torah gave a commandment that is entirely dependent upon the private individual choosing to want to know what's happening. And I think that actually underscores Sefer HaChinuch's basic point here about why this might be happening as a person. Think about who this person is if Sefer HaChinuch has the right take on why this is happening. This is somebody who is into, let's call it a corrupted lifestyle. They have clearly chosen much of their time not to ask, is what I'm doing right? If they had asked that question often, they wouldn't end up in that kind of lifestyle. Yes, we know that people from time to time, we walk off the path. That happens, and everybody does it, and everyone hopefully comes back. But there are some who go off the path and they keep going. They're the ones who are being included in this. What would it take to make them think twice about the decisions they've made? And Sefer HaChinuch says, what would it take to make you go to a priest when what you have done has been the antithesis of Torah? Well, you'd probably have to have something that you could not ignore that was happening to yourself. And that you would go, I remember reading something about this that this is possibly brought on by the lifestyle I'm leading or abnormal things going on, maybe I should have this looked at. Maybe I should check this as a symptom of what I'm doing rather than just ignore it. And it's all contingent upon that point of being willing to second guess what you're doing by having a symptom that something is wrong. Now, for most of us, we'll finish up the text here, but for most of us, we may look at this and say, oh, it's weird stuff, or who would ignore something like that? But don't we all have that trouble? When there's something wrong in our life, there's something out of balance, out of whack, and symptoms start cropping up. And I'm not just talking about the physical symptoms of, I can't go up 2 flights of stairs without sweating and passing out. I'm talking about the emotional symptoms of, why do I always feel tense around this person? Why am I always unhappy after I do this? Why am at this time of year do I get so upset about these things? Why am I having arguments with this person who used to always be my friend, and we are arguing about nothing? Those are symptoms. Those are discharges, if you will, that require examination. Doesn't mean necessarily a corrupted living, but it does mean that there is something out of balance that is causing things to happen in ways they don't normally cause or don't normally happen on their own. And we need to seek remedies. We shouldn't just ignore symptoms of what must be an underlying issue.
But depending upon our personalities, we each choose different ways of dealing with it. So somebody might go to a doctor,
right,
or a spouse or a close friend and talk about the relationship problem, and another one might just submerge it,
right,
and ignore it.
And Torah is basically saying that whole submerging, ignoring, that's not the solution. Right. Whether or not going to a doctor is going to be the right cure, or going to a friend is going to be the right cure, or a family member, or whether seeking more information through our tradition and the wisdom of our people, that may be a much more personal path. But seeking a solution outside of yourself is what the Torah is laying out as being the precondition before any real healing happens. That we don't get to just heal ourselves by ignoring the problem, or even by sitting and just thinking hard about the problem. We need someone else to interact with to really come to grips with whatever's causing this.
I think in today's lifestyle, our tendency is to go to a rabbi for spiritual concerns, but we don't think of coming to you, or some of us don't,
right,
automatically.
Many do not, exactly. We don't need to worry about the proportion.
When there's a problem with a friend, or
right,
with a spouse, maybe with a spouse, but not with.
Maybe, but even that, not as it used to be. I mean, people will come to ask, how do I light candles? Rabbi, is this kosher? Rabbi, I don't quite understand this prayer, or why we pray, or help me understand a bit more about God or our history. Those are the kinds of typical questions. But I'm having trouble with my friend, or I find myself getting angry every time I ...
And in retrospect, thinking about it today, it seems a very logical and appropriate action to take, to come to a rabbi and say, I'm having these concerns.
We in the Western world, we separated out our concerns and our worries as being mental illnesses, and then we treat them as other illnesses, meaning we go to a medical professional to diagnose and to treat. And we forget that for all of the thousands of years of human history, we have treated those with wisdom. And the best of that wisdom has survived and sustained our people for 3,000 years of time-tested, well researched and discussed methodology for dealing with those issues. Because people have not fundamentally changed in that time period. And there is still very much a very important contribution and part to be played by the wisdom literature of our people for dealing with many of the problems that people face on a routine basis. There is also a huge component that needs full medical research and help and assistance for many of the symptoms and underlying chemical issues, but not all of it needs to be treated in that manner. And recognizing that we have, for this very reason, this wisdom literature is a big part of what Torah is, and a big part of realizing that Judaism is more than an expression of my spirituality, but is a tool for improving myself in my life. Should we finish the page?
Yes.
Okay.
This rule that a person with a discharge is called unclean applies in every place and every time.
All right, so this has not been canceled.
However, now that for our sins we have no sanctuary or practices of ritual cleanness, we cannot reckon the defilement of a man with a discharge as a precept in force, since there is nothing at all for us to do in regard to the discharge.
I can't bring turtle doves as a sacrifice, which means that ritual impurity stays permanently. But there's no place that I need to worry about ritual impurity because there's no temple for me to go to anyway. So it doesn't seem to, in quote, matter, except for the lesson that he's trying to teach us, that it matters because of why it might be happening, even if it doesn't matter in a practical ritual sense. And that is the point of self-investigation.
The significance of an offering is to hint at the degradation of the body's desiring inclination and the exaltation of the spirit of intelligence. Thus, when a man with the discharge is cured, it is fitting for him to realize the evil of his craving and to set his body straight with all his power. But the significance of the offering, by the significance of the offering, he will begin to learn his moral lesson.
So a really interesting little finish here where he says, you bring the sacrifice to teach you the lesson that there was something going wrong. Because you'll notice for the other, like the regular nidah and the regular seminal emission, there's no sacrifice involved with it. That's just the normal part of life. These things, intimacy with your spouse and the monthly cycle for women are just normal. This is different. And you should be thinking about this, and the sacrifice should help you think this. But what he's introduced here, or at least brought to our attention, is the idea that just because it went away for a while doesn't mean the underlying cause has completely gone away. That the sacrifice both finishes one episode, but it also begins your reflection on the underlying moral question. And that should prevent you, because you've reflected and changed, from ever coming back again with the same problem. And that's a very important reminder that just because the issue goes away for a while, if you haven't dealt with what was causing it, doesn't mean it won't come back. And certainly in our interpersonal relations, just because you and your friends stopped arguing for a couple months doesn't mean whatever you were really upset about isn't going to flare up again in 6 months when it triggers because of some other issue, if you've never really discussed it and worked it out. Right? It's just lying there latent. You got to work it out or it's going to crash again. Now you may be wondering, okay, so I guess that means that we're all walking around ritually impure, and normally ritually impure, there's lots of stuff you can't do. For example, it was a proclamation by Ezra and his court, Ezra being the leader of the Jewish people when we came back from the land of Babylon after the first exile, that if you had had a seminal emission, just the regular, normal, me and the wife kind of seminal emission, you can't read Torah. You can't read from the Torah. Right? How could you come up to the Torah if you have had this emission, right? Because you're ritually impure. But read our final text and see what Rambam says about this.
And Ezra and his court ordained,
Tiknu, ordained, made a takana, made an ordinance.
that an ejaculant in particular among those who are categorized as impure, not read the Shema until he immerses.
Right, so the Shema is part of Torah, right? It's a Torah text. Yeah. So you would, according to Ezra, you had intimacy the night before. When you wake up in the morning, you're still ritually impure because you haven't gone and immersed yet. You can't say the Shema until you go to the mikveh, which would be rather difficult to constantly be delaying your prayers and other forms of observance because you had been carrying out your mitzvah duties with regards to your spouse. So,
But this ordinance,
takana,
did not spread among Israel, and the congregation of Israel did not have the strength to uphold it. Therefore, the ordinance was annulled.
right? So Ezra proclaimed, and the people went, I get what you're going for, Ezra, but it's talking about having the line outside the door every morning at the mikveh before services, and yeah, I don't think we can do that. And so it didn't catch on. And so remember again, as I said before, about there being a limit to how far we will pursue purification, and that the Torah tries to give us a limit. Ezra tried to extend the limit. He tried to make it a little bit more stringent, and the people went, no, we can't go that far. We can absolutely keep what the Torah says, but this bonus stringency that you've now put on us, we just can't do it. That additional stringency is one we can't shoulder. And so we revert to the limit the Torah gave us, which makes sure that we don't ignore things that are happening to us that are important signs for our life, and also that we don't obsess and dwell and overindulge our desire to seek constant purification, which can become its own form of debilitating lifestyle. Something that if you've ever visited, looking around the room, I'm guessing pretty much all of you have been to the Dead Sea at some point, and you have been to the Dead Sea community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. One of the things that characterized that community was a constant obsession with ritual purity, where they would go into the mikveh multiple times every single day. And they did have lines, and you can see in the mikveh there were stairs going down and there were stairs coming up, and people would walk in one side, turn around the wall, and come out the other side like a conveyor belt. That community is gone. That community was buried in the desert by the sands. There is a limit to how far we can, as a whole community, pursue. Certain individuals perhaps can live that way. The rest of us can't. But we do need some level of recognition that these issues matter, and that these issues should make us think, reflect, and seek the wisdom of our people. So don't skip these pages when you're reading. All right, thank you very much, as always.
Thank you.